Hi, and welcome to My Words, Our Journey, episode 4 of the Souls of Willow. Last time, if you remember, we ended the episode with the Murray brothers being jailed after the fire in the fields. They were visited by Willow, who had a premonition of events that would come. She'd also saved their mother and told her to run any direction except for going back towards the village. Anywhere would be better than that. I'm Monty, your host, and today we'll start with Chapter 11. The following morning, the townsfolk gathered to see what the devastation looked like in the light of day. Most were not ready for the scene. All the crops gone, livestock the same. Even their water storage had been damaged, which no one could understand. It had been drained dry. It didn't have to be said. There would be none that would survive until spring without a miracle. Some would stay because of health reasons of family members, while others would try to make it to the adjacent settlement, which was 25 miles away, but over and through rough terrain, making the trip, at best, 5 days. Most did not have 5 days' worth of food remaining. Why would they? Why would they have rationed? The crops, the livestock, they were plentiful just the day before. The anger swelled deep. Cell doors slammed open as the brothers were awoken to aggressive men yanking them from their feet and tossing them out of the cell, including young Zachary. Their mother watched from the edge of the woods. She had not run, as the nun had suggested. Where would she go? How would she survive? It had been so long since she was young and fearless. Now she sat, cold, wet, from the dew, and sad for her family. Already knowing the ending, the mother still could not make herself look away. With tear-filled eyes and trembling hands, she watched as the boys were raised and put on the poles, hands tied behind their backs, and only a thin piece of wood for their feet, which were now bare, to stand on. It was meant to be painful and humiliating, and once up there, you did not come down until you took your last breath. She had made up her mind sometime during the frigid night. Taking the small but sharp blade from her pocket, she rolled it around in her hand. It was the only thing that she had left from her father. She had almost sold it numerous times when the family needed the money, but she just couldn't. 2 quick swipes, and then she closed her eyes. She wanted her last thoughts to be of her boys when they were young, innocent. Not like they were now. Life had been hard, but she could pull some good memories from her mind, and those she would focus on as the blood left her body and turned the fallen leaves to crimson. Her sons were helpless, as the nun had said the night before. They were fully aware of their surroundings, but now, for whatever reason, they could not speak and could barely move their bodies. They knew the end was near. The temperature would drop overnight, and if that didn't kill them, there was a good chance the wild animals that lurked on the fringe of the woods would. By dusk, the townsfolk had departed the square and took shelter in their cottages with their warm fires and small meals. The brothers could not communicate with each other, could not even make eye contact. They couldn't turn their heads. So when Zachary witnessed the figure coming down out of the woods, it was as if he were alone, struggling not to fall off the narrow ledge. He had heard of men losing their footing and dislocating their shoulders with all their weight, now supported by their upper body. Still, they would hang there in agony until death. In what felt like an instant, the nun now stood directly in front of the youngest. When she raised her head with her eyes, they met. He held her gaze, feeling as if it was important not to look away. They stared at each other, locked for a moment, before she walked past each brother. None of them would meet her gaze. When she walked back to Zachary, she whispered, "If your life is spared, will you follow the path of your brothers?" One can tell the truth in another's eyes if they look deep enough. Willow looked deep, and she was pleased with what she saw. In a moment, he found himself following the nun towards the wood. He felt like maybe he should run, but run where? So he followed. When she stopped, he was glad that he hadn't run. Before him, lying on the ground, looking weak but alive, was his mother and younger sister, their effort to smile not lost on the young man. The embrace lasted until the nun began to pray. It was a prayer for their safe travel, the woman's health, strength, and their determination, and of course, the Lord's hand to protect them. When she was done, the small family stood. The nun handed them a wrapped cloth, which contained some supplies for the trip, and then she took her water canteen and handed it to them as well. When she pointed away from the mountains and towards the openness that headed west, the trio was stunned. They had no idea what laid ahead of them. Again, the knight pointed in that direction. This time, Willow did it with purpose. Zachary took their hands and held tight as they watched the nun and her 2 dogs slowly walk away until they were gone. As Willow could feel the eyes upon her, she thought about their road ahead, the obstacles they must overcome. Then, without much thought, Willow spoke to the birds and the trees. Go with them, keep them safe until their journey ends. Hundreds, if not thousands of birds of all shapes and sizes obeyed her simple command and began to circle overhead in a holding pattern while they waited for the mother and children to begin their walk. Chapter 12. Maddie's eyes had closed. He had been given the duty of staying awake while his counterpart took a nap. They were in charge of the courthouse that particular evening. The barking of the dogs caused him to jump to his feet right before Tobias came stumbling from one of the cells. Grabbing 2 heavy pieces of wood, the pair cautiously opened the door and went outside. It was a dark night. The flames that had been placed around the brothers had gone out hours ago. The moon, however, was full and low. There, lying next to each other, were 2 of the most handsome dogs the men had ever seen. With grace, Thunder and Storm stood and casually walked to the corner of the stone building, and then around to the next. The curious men followed. The spear that was waiting for them, it took Willow 2 days to sharpen to the point she wanted. It was worth it. She waited until they were both completely behind the building. Then she plunged the weapon first through Maddie, and then it pierced the second man. The spear had found vital organs on both, and they died where they stood. The sight was eerie, as they appeared to be some kind of weird puppets on a stick. In the early morning hours, a group of men had gathered to go hunting. Each was stunned and disturbed what they saw. First, the 3 brothers were still alive, while the 4th was missing. No sign of him. No blood. No nothing. Then the 2 men were found behind the courthouse, a disturbing sight that would haunt. The prayer, or curse, depending on who you asked, that Willow had placed on the brothers was extending their lives as long as possible. Without food or water, without medical attention, they should have passed already, but they would live another agonizing 3 days before passing. By the time mercy was granted, all 3 smelled of death. No one dared to go near the town square, for if the smell didn't get you, the display would. Each had fallen off the ledges. Now they were disformed, skin discolored. Bugs of all sorts were making their homes and infesting their wounds. It was nothing you would wish on your worst enemy. It was the thing of nightmares. The small community that was a symbol of hope and hard work paying off was now reduced to, well, just the opposite. There was no hope. Hard work had not paid off, and death was taking them. Those that believed in such things swore the area was cursed after the death of the nuns. Those that did not would only say something about the Lord and his will. Some would mention Job from the Bible and all his tribulations the Lord had let the devil put on him, and how he had come out stronger. It really depended on the time of day and whom you were speaking with. Inside they all knew one thing for sure. Unless there was that miracle that some hoped for, most, if not all, would perish. If Willow's souls had any say in the matter, no miracle would dare enter this place. Chapter 13. Zachary's mother's name was Helen, and his youngest sister, Wilma. The 3 walked at a steady pace as they headed towards the unknown. Their people had never traveled this direction. It was barren as far as the eye could see. Doubt had crept in. But why would the nuns save them, only to send them to their deaths? The young boy's thoughts swirled between his father and his brother. Both appeared as if they were standing in front of him. Why had he not been able to save them somehow? He knew the answer. He wasn't dumb, but it was all he could think about. It was not until he heard the voices off in the distance that he snapped back to the reality of the situation. A situation that found him, a mere boy, walking through open terrain with nowhere to run or hide, accompanied by his mother and sister. The men grew closer. There were 5 of them, their words still unclear. Mother pulled them tight. Zachary was as scared as he'd ever been in his life. Pete had heard his older brothers time and time again. You can't let them see the fear. So he pulled away from his mom and shouted, "Just keep moving on. We don't have anything for you." Still, they advanced. Now a little quicker, it seemed. The trio had stopped in their tracks. There was nowhere to run, even if they thought they could. Helen placed her children behind her for whatever protection she could offer. The men were filthy. It was clear they had been wandering for a while. When the first spoke, it was almost became clear that they meant to harm her and the children. The words slurred, but the message received. They were not nice men. They weren't there to help in any way. As two of the men grabbed Helen, the children began to scream and yell. Zachary had been picking up rocks as they had been walking for no apparent reason. Now, he used those rocks to throw at the men as hard as he could. It became chaotic, to the point no one noticed the approaching mass until it was on top of them. It was a hurricane of motion, black cloud descending over the eight. The sounds of the wings, tremendous pain, and crying of the grown men lasted no more than a minute. During that time, Helen, Wilma, and Zachary could feel the wings brush against their skin, almost tickling, and the wind was blowing their hair and clothes with force. The three could not keep their eyes open, so all they could do was imagine by the sounds that they heard, the sounds that could not be mistaken for anything but death. Their protectors left as quickly as they had arrived, two lying on the ground, both alive but injured. Wilma was tended to the fallen birds as Helen and Zachary surveyed what was left of the men. First, they did not look like men anymore, not even close. They had been shown no mercy. Second, the trio could now trust that the nuns' words had been heard and the task accepted by the birds. After the horrible job of checking each of their pockets for valuables, they sat quietly by the injured birds, Wilma rubbing their heads and humming to them. Night would be upon them soon, so mother and son gathered what little sticks and debris they could find and tried to build a fire. As they worked, several birds landed close, all with various sized sticks in their beaks. They dropped them close to the pile, and one by one moved close to their fallen. It was eerie to Zachary, somehow. They had been so vicious for a minute, and now so peaceful and caring the next. Then he decided he was just glad they were on their side. Chapter 14. Decisions had been made during this ordeal. Some decided to leave the day after the fire. Others had made tough decisions to stay for one reason or another. Most had something to do with the health of a family member. The history books would have very little to say about the events that happened here, those that chose to stay or the ones that braved the trip and left. Out of the families remaining, 2 were keeping journals of the events that would eventually be recovered and read and studied. The community was small in size, but it housed many families, several generations, in fact. That history would be lost. Any record that may be kept of the travelers was never found. Their fate is left to the imagination of those that studied such things, the area, its predators, and the time of year. However, whatever theory you came up with, no matter how bad, was nothing compared to the horrors that were experienced. Willow's souls ensured those that ran would suffer equally, if not more, than those that stayed. For those that stayed, spiders. The morning was cool. The dead had been disposed of the day prior. Anything that could be salvaged had been. The families had been civil, helping one another, sharing the few items that may or may not be useful down the road. Wood had been gathered to keep them warm. At best, the adults knew the longest they may have, under perfect conditions, would be a week. Still, they had to try. Everyone had gathered in the morning for prayer, for themselves, but also for the travelers. They also asked for forgiveness for whatever happened in the convent. During the lengthy prayer, one child was stirring. She began to stare up towards the woods and daydream a little. That is when she noticed the blackish shape slowly exiting the tree line and moving like a wave down the hill. It was mesmerizing. There was no way for the youngster to know what was coming for them. She tugged on her father's arm. He shrugged her off, keeping his eyes closed and his mind focused on the prayer. She then went to her mother, who opened her eyes and knelt down. In front of them, a large mass, about to enter the square. Spiders. thousands upon thousands of spiders, moving as one. With a scream, the attack began. Black widow spiders marching into the square, and then attacking adults, children, and pets. The men began stomping and looking for anything to hit them with. The women gathered their children and tried to get to shelter. A single black widow spider bite, while painful, is generally not deadly, but what the crowd was experiencing was far from singular. The arachnid's fangs were puncturing in multiples. There was simply nowhere to run. They had infiltrated every corner of the square and beyond. It did not take long before the pain, swelling, and muscle cramps kicked in. Some of the men, mostly the elders, lay on the ground as hordes of spiders made their way over top of them. In less than 12 minutes it was over, the pack marching back towards the woods the same way they had come. Only this time, there was no rush. Their work was done. Only a few men still stood. The rest had given in to the venom and were lying on the ground, either dead or dying. Those standing were large men, the poison not taking their hold just yet, but it would. They were essentially lost as well. They just didn't know it yet. For the ones that thought they had gotten away by not staying and fighting, who were now hiding in various corners in the darkness, heard the scream turn to stillness. Which was more frightening, the screams or the quiet? They would have little time to contemplate. Snakes. From nowhere and everywhere, the various species of snakes converged on every young male, and old as well. Most were bitten numerous times by several different snakes, while some were squeezed to their death. Neither was a more pleasant end than the other. The women could only watch in horror, as baby to elder could only succumb to the enormous number of snakes that were now working in teams to put down even the largest of males. Chapter 15. Helen was awoken to the birds. For the first time, they seemed to be encouraging her and her children to pick up the pace of their journey. She had been watching them for days, their actions, the way they interacted with each other, but also with them. The birds worked as a unit, with what seemed to be one purpose, to get them to their destination safely. It was a comfort for sure, but there was also part of her that worried. Could something cause the flock to turn on them? Before she could answer the question, several birds of various shapes and sizes brought greens, nuts, and berries for their breakfast. No guess where they had to flown to get such nourishment, but she had stopped trying to guess. Now it was just appreciated, no questions asked. In the distance, she could make out a tall structure. It appeared to reach the clouds from their distance. The White Witch must have instructed the fowl to bring them there. For their safety? Or an evil purpose? Only time would tell. While the mother contemplated her now small family's future, the women of the village had gathered in the common area. Gathered may not be the proper wording. You see, the snakes, after making sure all the men were dead, had turned their attention to the females, herding each to the common area, where death was everywhere. Not to be outmatched by the snakes, the spiders had completed their task as well. As the women looked around at each other, but also taking in their surroundings, all of them above a certain age could sense something was about to happen. They were not wrong. From approximately the same clearing as the spiders, Willow appeared with Storm and Thunder at her side. Slowly, but with purpose, she descended the hill until she stood in front of the now even more frightened group, if that was possible. Looking from person to person, Willow made eye contact and made note of those that made eye contact back with her. If the situation was reversed at a different time and place, Willow was not sure she would have been so bold. But still, there was a few that met her gaze. It didn't matter in the large scheme of things. The passengers knew exactly who would be standing when this was done. The passengers raised their voice in unison. Willow only had to open her mouth for the words to be heard loud and clear. "Because we are all women, you will be spared." A huge gasp could be heard from the crowd. Then the voice finished the sentence. "Spared from the painful and violent death of your loved ones. You will all fall into a deep sleep. For some, your journey is over. For others, a new beginning awaits. Then with a whisper, Domorcico. Willow would find out later this meant fall asleep in Latin. Chapter 16. Helen, Zachary, and Wilma had been at their new home for 2 full days. It had been glorious so far. Clean water, food prepared daily by the amazing women of the community. They had let Helen and Wilma start helping at supper by the second day. Zachary had been taken in by the young men. He was helping build a new fence around what would later be a chicken coop. Helen found herself longing for the rest of her family. At the same time, she felt so blessed they had been guided to this place at this time. She was a believer. She had been since she could remember. She truly felt everything happened for a reason, and that the White Witch was put in her path to lead them to this place. Which would also mean her sons were meant to do the awful things they were accused of doing as well. It was not easy to wrap her mind around her faith. It was early morning on the third day when they heard the commotion from the area at the front gate. Helen asked Zachary to tend to her sister while she went to see what was happening. When she arrived, the guards and many townsfolk were taking in a very large group of women. Helen could recognize many of the faces right away, her neighbors, friends, and fellow church members. With excitement, she pushed her way to the front. It was then that one of the guards asked her if she knew these people. It seemed they had escaped the nightmare and were asking for refuge only while they recovered from the events and travel. Everyone could see the community was not big enough to take in such a large group, even for a short time. Helen was more than pleased to acknowledge to her friends and others. It made her feel good that she could be the bridge between her new and old friends. On her word, the gate was opened, and the mass began to move through. It was not until Helen noticed Mary, her dearest of friends, from the crowd. Helen took her by the arm and pulled her out of the commotion. That is when she looked deep into her eyes. They were not her eyes. They were black as night, and they appeared to dance in the early morning night moonlight. Helen let go with a panic and watched as her friend continued on. The questions led to the same conclusions. How many nuns did they say died in the convent? How had these women escaped the horrors that had taken place at the old community? Why were there no men in the group? Why did they all have the same walk, in step like they had been practicing for months? And now why did they have all the deep-set black eyes? As one of the guards watched the tail end of the group make its way through the gate, Willow and her 2 faithful friends were the last to enter. He whispered, "The village just got a lot more interesting." Willow moved in close with the speed and grace of a lion. While the soldier looked deep into the blackness of her eyes, she smiled with an evil smile and whispered back, "You have no idea." And that is where I chose to end this journey. I'll let you decide what happens next. Did the community survive? Did the passengers move on? Or did they take over the community and stay? Did God eventually take them? Or do they still roam the earth looking for some sort of vengeance, revenge? And if so, upon who? Thank you for listening to this journey, the Souls of Willow. Have a great day.